The radio crackled with static, and for a moment, General Friedrich Paulus thought it might be a mistake. The numbers on the map in front of him could not be right. You have seen maps like this in history books, covered in arrows and shaded zones, and you have probably glanced at them quickly, trying to absorb the strategy, the movement, the scope. But if you had been standing in that freezing bunker in Stalingrad on the morning of November 23, 1942, staring at that same map, you would have understood instantly. Not as a historian, not as a student, but in your gut, in the cold marrow of your bones, that something had just died. Not a man, not a unit, an entire army, an entire war. This is the story of the moment. The German High Command understood they had made an error from which there was no return. It is not a story about weakness. The men involved were among the most decorated, most experienced military commanders in the world. It is a story about pride, about ideology overriding arithmetic, about what happens when men at the top of an institution stop hearing the truth from those beneath them. And it is a story that has lessons so sharp they can still cut you today, 8 decades later. To understand what happened at Stalingrad, you have to go back a little further. Not years, just months, to the summer of 1942. Germany was in its 3rd year of war against the Soviet Union. Operation Barb, launched in June 1941, had been the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3 million German and Axis soldiers had crossed into Soviet territory in a 3-pronged assault that aimed to destroy the Red Army before winter. It had almost worked. The Wehrmacht had driven deep into Russia, captured millions of prisoners, destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft. By December 1941, German advance units could see the spires of Moscow through their binoculars. But Moscow did not fall. The Soviet Union did not collapse. And now, a year later, Germany needed something it had not anticipated needing: a second decisive victory, because the first one had not been decisive enough. Hitler's plan for the summer of 1942, Case Blue, was built around a strategic pivot. Forget Moscow for now. Drive southeast, seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, Baku, Makop, Grozny, and strangle Soviet industry. Without oil, the Red Army could not fuel its tanks, its trucks, its aircraft. The war would end not with a dramatic capture of a capital, but with an economic strangulation. On paper, it was sound thinking. Germany's own fuel situation was becoming critical. The war needed to be shortened, and oil was the key. But there was a problem with Case Blue, and the problem had a name. Stalingrad. The city sat on the western bank of the Volga River, stretching along it for 30 miles. It was a major industrial center, producing tanks and artillery shells. More importantly, it was a communications hub, the railway junction that connected the southern Soviet Union to its northern and central regions, and it had another quality that would prove fatal to rational planning. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin. Initially, Stalingrad was not even the primary objective of Case Blue. It was a flank protection measure. The German 6th Army, under Paulus, was to advance toward the city and secure the northern flank of the main drive into the Caucasus, take the high ground, disrupt Soviet communications, maybe seize part of the city. That was it. That was the assignment. Then Hitler changed the orders. What began as a flank security mission became a full assault on the city itself, and what began as a strategic objective became, through the alchemy of ego and symbolism, something else entirely: a contest of wills between two dictators who had attached their personal prestige to a single point on the map. For Hitler, taking Stalin's city was not just militarily important, it was a humiliation to be inflicted, a name to be erased. For Stalin, defending it was not just operationally significant, it was existential, personal, non-negotiable. And so, Paulus marched the 6th Army straight into the killing ground. The battle for Stalingrad began in earnest in September 1942. The Luftwaffe bombed the city so thoroughly that it turned the landscape into a rubble field, which, paradoxically, helped the defenders more than the attackers. Street fighting in ruins is not the same as open-field tank maneuver warfare. The German military's greatest weapon, its ability to combine armor, infantry, and air power in fast, coordinated thrusts, was neutralized in a labyrinth of collapsed buildings and sewer tunnels. The Soviets, under General Vasily Chukov, turned the city into a slaughterhouse. They pushed their defensive lines as close to the German front lines as possible. Close enough that artillery from both sides became dangerous to use. They called it hugging the enemy. Stay close enough to his skin that he cannot bomb you without bombing himself. Every factory, every train station, every grain elevator became a fortress. Buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. The famous department store, the grain silo, the Mamayev Kurgan Hill overlooking the city. These were not just tactical positions. They were the entire substance of the battle. Men died by the thousands. 4 rooms, 4 staircases, 4 windows. The Sixth Army was being devoured, and it was being devoured slowly enough that it could not stop feeding itself into the machine. All through September and October and into November, Paulus sent reports back to Army Group B and to Hitler's headquarters. The army needed reinforcements. It needed more men, more ammunition, more fuel. It was taking losses it could not replace. The flanks of the Sixth Army, stretching north and south along the Don River, were held not by German troops. There were not enough of those, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allied forces. These were not contemptible soldiers, but they were less well-equipped, less experienced, and they lacked the anti-tank weapons to stop the Soviet armor that was known to be massing behind the lines. The reports were received. The requests were noted, and then, at Hitler's headquarters, they were essentially ignored. The Führer had convinced himself that the Soviets were exhausted, that they had nothing left, that one more push would finish them. His intelligence apparatus, which had consistently underestimated Soviet production and manpower reserve since 1941, continued to feed him numbers that suited his expectations. And the generals around him, with a few exceptions, had learned that with Hitler was a career-ending and sometimes life-ending proposition. So they told him what he wanted to hear, or they stayed quiet. This is what happens when a military institution loses its ability to transmit bad news upward. The feedback loop breaks. The decision-maker becomes isolated inside a bubble of his own preferred reality, and the men on the ground, who know exactly what is happening because they are bleeding for it, watch in a kind of horrified disbelief as orders arrive from above that bear no relationship to the world they are standing in. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus. General Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky had been planning it for months, in extraordinary secrecy. The concept was classical, the same kind of deep encirclement operation that the Germans themselves had used with such devastating effect in 1941. Mass overwhelming force on the weak flanks, punch through the Romanian lines north and south of the city, swing the 2 pincers together behind the Sixth Army, and trap it. The northern pinch struck first. At 7:30 in the morning, in fog and snow, the Romanian Third Army, holding the Don River line, was hit by 5 Soviet armies, over 900,000 men, 900 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces. The Romanians fought hard, but they had almost no armor, no reserves, and nowhere near enough anti-tank guns. Within hours, Soviet tank columns were pouring through the gaps. The northern pincer was moving fast. The southern pincer struck the next day. Same story. The Romanian Fourth Army collapsed under the weight of the Soviet assault. More tank columns, moving deeper, moving faster than German headquarters had believed possible. The 2 pincers met at the town of Kalak on November 23rd. It took them 4 days. In those 4 days, 300,000 men of the German Sixth Army were in. Now we are back to that bunker. Back to Paulus, staring at the map. The circle on the map was called the Kessel, the cauldron, and it was real. The Sixth Army was surrounded, cut off from all land supply routes, deep in the Russian steppe as winter arrived in full force. Temperatures would drop to -40 degrees Celsius. The army had supplies calculated 4 days, not months. It had wounded men who needed evacuation, sick men who needed medicine, healthy men who were about to become one or the other. What should have happened next was simple. Break out, attack westward, punch through the Soviet encirclement before it consolidated, link up with German forces outside, and get the men out. It would be costly. It might mean abandoning heavy equipment, but it was survivable. Paulus asked for permission to break out. Hermann J. Ring commander of the Luft, stepped in with an alternative proposal that would haunt German military history forever. He told Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air 500 tons of supplies per day, enough to sustain 300,000 men through the winter until a relief force could break through. It was a number pulled from ambition rather than calculation. The Luftwaffe's own logistics experts knew it was impossible. The transport aircraft did not exist in sufficient numbers. The airfields inside the Kessel were improvised strips in frozen ground. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft batteries would intercept the supply convoys. The weather alone would ground aircraft for days at a time. But Göring said it could be done, and Hitler wanted to believe it. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold. He declared Stalingrad a fortress. He told Paulus that he would be supplied from the air and relieved by ground forces before the end of the year. Paulus overjed. It is impossible to know exactly what ran through his mind as he transmitted the order to his corps commanders. Hold your positions. Relief is coming. The Führer has given his word. Some of his subordinates were furious. General Hans Valentin Hube reportedly told him bluntly that breaking out was the only rational course of action, and that waiting for aerial supply was a death sentence. General Walter von Sedletskersbach, commanding one of the corps inside the pocket, actually ordered his own units to prepare a breakout without Paulus's authorization. The order was countermanded. Outside the pocket, a relief operation was being organized. Army Group Don, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the most gifted operational commanders in any army of the Second World War, launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12th. The relief force drove toward Stalingrad from the southwest, getting to within 48 kilometers of the encircled army at its closest point. Manstein sent a private signal to Paulus, "If you can break out now toward us, we can link up." He called it Operation Thunderclap. He knew, even if Hitler did not, that the situation was becoming irreversible. Paulus waited for explicit orders from Hitler. The orders did not come. Hitler refused to authorize any withdrawal from Stalingrad because he believed, or claimed to believe, that breaking out meant abandoning the Volga line, which meant conceding strategic failure, which meant the entire southern strategy of 1942 had been a waste. Better to hold and be relieved than to retreat and admit defeat. He could not process the reality that relief was failing. Manstein's relief force was stopped and pushed back. The window closed. Inside the Kessel, the winter was killing men as efficiently as the Soviet guns. The daily supply flights delivered a fraction of what was needed. On good days, perhaps 100 tons, instead of the promised 500. Men ate their horses. They developed frostbite, then gangrene, then they eat. The hospital facilities became scenes of medieval suffering. Officers who had commanded thousands of men found themselves unable to provide those men with enough food to stand upright. The generals inside the pocket understood by December that they were not going to be relieved. This was not pessimism. It was arithmetic. The relief force had been turned back. The aerial supply was failing by numbers everyone could see. The Soviet armies surrounding them were growing stronger every week, not weaker. The Sixth Army was shrinking, not just in morale, but in physical capacity. The fighting strength of divisions that had entered Stalingrad in September was now measured in hundreds of men, instead of thousands. And yet the orders from Hitler continued to arrive in the same tone. Hold, reinforce, the Führer believes in you. Relief is coming, do not surrender. There is a document that survives from this period. A message sent by one of the Corps' commanders inside the pocket to Army Group headquarters. That is almost unbearable to read. In precise military language, stripped of emotion, the general describes the actual state of his corps. How many men are fit for combat, how much ammunition remains, what the casualty rate has been per day, how long the current supply trajectory can sustain operations. He then projects these numbers forward to an end date. The end date is not far away, he asks. With the controlled restraint of a professional soldier writing to superiors, he still respects what the actual plan is. whether relief is genuinely coming, or whether he and his men are expected to die in place. The answer he received was another order to hold up. On January 8, 1943, the Soviet command sent Paulus a formal surrender ultimatum. They offered honorable terms: life, food, medical treatment, eventual repatriation. Paulus rejected it. On Hitler's orders, the Red Army launched its final offensive, Operation Ring, on January 10th. The Kessel began to be compressed from all sides. The end came in pieces. The northern pocket in the factory district was crushed first. Then the central sector. By the last days of January, the Sixth Army's remnants were squeezed into two shrinking islands of rubble in a city that no longer resembled a city. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal. It was a symbolic gesture, but it carried an implicit message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Either fight to the last man, or take the hint and shoot yourself. Paulus did neither. On January 31st, he surrendered. It was over. Roughly 91,000 survivors of the Sixth Army went into Soviet captivity. Of those, approximately 6,000 would eventually return to Germany. The rest died in the camps of wounds, of cold, of hunger, of the consequences of what had been done to them before they were captured. The German officer corps knew, from that moment, what the map had been telling them for months. The war was lost. Not immediately. Not overnight. There were 2 more years of terrible fighting to come, but strategically, fundamentally, at the level of resources and manpower and will, the arc of the conflict had bent. Stalingrad consumed irreplaceable men, irreplaceable officers, irreplaceable equipment. It destroyed the myth of German military invincibility that had been built since 1939. It gave the Soviet Union its first great victory. And with that victory came something harder to quantify but equally important: belief. The Red Army now knew it could beat the Wehrmacht in pitched battle. The generals who survived understood this with a clarity that many of them later described in memoirs, in testimony, in private letters. General Erich von Manstein, in his memoir Lost Victories, wrote about the strategic consequence with the precision of someone who had watched the catastrophe from close range and been unable to stop it. The loss was not just tactical. It was not just operational. It was the inflection point of the entire Eastern Front. What makes Stalingrad so instructive, so worth sitting with even now, is not the scale of the disaster. It is the mechanism. The German military in 1942 was not staffed by fools or cowards. Its generals were among the most technically proficient commanders alive. Its soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and, in many cases, genuinely courageous. The system worked on the battlefield. What failed was the connection between the battlefield and the command structure above it. Information flowed upward and was discarded. Analysis was performed and then ignored when it produced inconvenient results. Alternatives were raised and then suppressed when they contradicted the preferred narrative. Paulus was not a weak man in the conventional sense. He was a methodical, capable officer who had been deeply involved in the planning of but he had been trained in a system that valued obedience to the point where obedience became its own moral framework. Disobeying Hitler was not merely professionally risky. For an officer of his generation and background, it represented a violation of something close to sacred obligation. And so he stayed. And his men stayed with him. And there are moments in history when the outcome becomes clear to those who are watching closely, long before it becomes clear to those who have the power to change it. November 23, 1942 was one of those moments. The encirclement was complete. The map showed what the map showed. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. What hung in the balance in the weeks that followed was not whether the Sixth Army could be saved by December. It almost certainly could not be. But whether a rational actor in command of the German war machine would accept the reality in front of him, cut his losses, and adjust strategy accordingly. No such acceptance came. The map was right. The generals knew it. But the man who could have done something about it, the man to whom all authority had been concentrated and all independent judgment had been surrendered, chose instead to believe that the map was lying. When you study this chapter of history, you are studying something that goes beyond military strategy. You are studying what happens when an institution becomes incapable of telling its leader the truth. You are studying the price of that incapacity, counted in names, counted in suffering, counted in the slow freezing death of 300,000 men in a city on the Volga River. In the worst winter in a generation, the cold on that steppe was absolute. The hunger was absolute. The certainty, for those who thought clearly and looked at the map without flinching, was also absolute. The war was lost. De Icneu Italiano, and they could do nothing about it.